49ers back to back. I wouldn't be surprised if the Browns start off 1-3, and with no Chubb, obviously the whole season. I think it's kind of put them on a spiral. I don't love what I'm seeing, but I understand if you might have a little more faith than I do.
Yeah, this Browns team overall, I think, is still constructed very well offensively and defensively. And I still believe in Deshaun Watson. I think he'll be able to come out here and figure it out, especially with that wide receiver, that tight end room, especially if they get Kareem Hunt back. Obviously, Jerome Ford went out there and did what he needed to do in Nick Chubb's absence. And I think they'll be able to figure that out with Kareem Hunt, too. I think that'll be a good combination between both of those guys. I don't think they're going to run the ball as much, which might lean more on the offense, meaning Deshaun Watson's going to have to throw the ball a little more. And I think that'll be fine. I think he'll get into the swing of it. I don't know if he'll be back to that top five quarterback spot anytime soon, but he's going to be there for a while. He's still a guy who is relatively young. I know he spent a good amount of years in Houston, and some of that can be kind of forgotten almost to this point since everything that's gone on the past few years, but he still has a lot left in the tank, so I think he'll be able to figure it out. The start of the season hasn't impressed me that much. Last game, he looked all right out there, but I think this defense is still good enough to carry them to a good amount of wins if the offense can be all right. That Steelers team went out and Kenny Pickett played all right, but the rest of the team definitely stepped up. George Pickens was out there. And with pretty much every team in this division struggling, I know the Ravens are still undefeated to this point, but even Lamar Jackson doesn't really look like the Lamar Jackson we've seen in the past. So I still think it's a little early to call this division. I think the Browns still have a fair shake in here. I don't know if they'll win the division necessarily, but like we've said, they still have a good shot to make the playoffs just because there's so much competition in this division. And from the AFC standings right now, we've seen a lot of teams struggle, so they could even get into a wild card spot. I think they'll still be fine, but obviously that Nick Chubb injury hurts. And in a division with the best team, I think we could all agree that that Bengals team is probably the best constructed team. Being 0-2, it still gives them a good shot.
Yeah, and I just think I'm really more worried about Deshaun than you are, and that's fair. I just when I look at his numbers, it's like he's towards the bottom of the league in true passing rating. And the receivers, they are good on paper, but Amari Cooper is already struggling with injuries. Donovan Peoples-Jones is fun, but he's not a guy you can rely on every day. And yeah, Njoku is good, don't get me wrong, but he's not one of those elite level tight ends. So I do have some question marks with the Browns. I have no question marks with the defense. It's a well constructed defense for sure. But I don't know. I just have mixed opinions on that. And as you mentioned, the Ravens are 2-0. And although the Bengals are 0-2, I think we both agree that's one of the best teams in the AFC in general. I don't really see much positive looking forward for Cleveland, especially because the team that I expect them to compete with, the Steelers, they already just dropped a game to. So it's going to be interesting for sure. Far from over, really early. But if we're just talking the odds, I'm not super confident.
Another team that I want to ask you if you
Yeah.
think this season, 0-2 to this point, a very different feeling than if you were a Bengals fan. Obviously, the Bengals were 0-2 last year to start, still ended up going 13-4, but the Patriots now 0-2. And usually, if you lose your first two games by only a touchdown, you still have some hope. You know, you're in those games, but it just doesn't feel like there's much hope coming out of this New England area right now. I know depending on who you ask, some people still think Mac Jones can be the best quarterback in the NFL. I know you might have a different take, so I want to hear what you have to say about that. Despite the stats saying that he is
Yeah.
decent this year.
Yeah, and that's what makes the Patriots really interesting because I have almost zero to no faith in Mac Jones, and he hasn't been too bad. I will say he has looked good at times. I think this year, which is a different story than every other year, is that the offensive line actually has been pretty bad in the first couple of games, so he hasn't had a whole lot of time. But I'm just like you, pretty sick of excuses talking about the offensive coordinator every year. Most people can't even name the Bengals or the Bills offensive coordinator, and Josh Allen and Joe Burrow are good every year. So moving on from that, I think Christian Gonzalez looks like he's exactly what the Patriots defense needed. So when it comes to the defensive side of the ball, I do have a lot of faith in the Patriots. I think last year they probably had a top 10 defense in football, closer to 10 than one, but you get the idea. And I think that we're looking at something similar this year. My biggest problem, of course, is that offense, though. bringing in Zeke as a change of pace back is a good idea on paper, but realistically, so far, it's really only taken touches away from Ramondre Stevenson, and Stevenson's the best player on this offense. Juju got a big contract this offseason. He hasn't been getting involved early, and that's kind of a big problem for me when he's the number one receiver on the roster. So, I mean, like I said, I think the defense will be good, and the offense isn't the worst in the league or anything, but they probably have the hardest schedule in football. You start off 0-2. That Dolphins game felt like one that they really had to win. I understand the Dolphins are one of the better teams in the AFC. It wasn't going to be easy, but with the momentum they had in that game, multiple chances to win it towards the end, it felt like the Patriots had to go out and do it. And that's kind of exactly what we talked about after week 1 when they played the Eagles. The Patriots defense will give their offense chances to win it late, and the offense just won't do it. With that being said, they kind of are in a similar spot to the Browns, where they have the Bills, who are one of the better teams in the AFC. They have the Dolphins, who are already 2-0, and then they're supposed to be fighting with the Jets towards the bottom. If they go out and split games with the Jets or look bad against the Jets, it's like all over at that point, if we're being honest. I don't think that they are completely out of it yet. I maybe have a little more faith than I do with a team like Cleveland, which might be a hot take, but I also don't think that they're going to bounce back very well. I think it's 6-7 games on the win slot.
Yeah, and like you said, I think the big thing to note, this offensive line has been pretty solid the past few years. But looking at the stats right now, Mac Jones, he has the 4th least amount of time to throw the ball this season through the first 2 weeks, and he's been hurried the most and blitzed the most. I know the Dolphins do like to blitz a good amount, so that might be going into those stats too. But still, I mean, looking at those stats overall, like you said, this offensive line just hasn't been that great. And I mean, the schedule is going to be tough. You have, looking at these next few games, you're going to have some road games against the Jets, the Cowboys, the Dolphins, and then you also play against the Saints, the Raiders, and the Bills. The Raiders, I don't think that good of a team. Obviously, the Jets, their quarterback situation is still up in the air. Still a good team. The Saints have looked solid. But like you said, a real tough schedule, too. So within these next few weeks, I mean, going against the Jets, the Cowboys, the Saints, the Raiders, the Bills, and the Dolphins, what is the best case scenario coming out of that? Because I don't really see a winning record coming out of those. And if you're already at 0-2 in this point, it's going to be really tough.
Yeah, I mean, it's that question's a little rhetorical because I think we both know nothing good's going to come from it. But I think what you have to do is win those division games. They're not going to get Jets, Dolphins, and Bills in order. They're not going to win all of them. But if they go out and beat the Bills, then there's a little bit of a different feeling in Foxborough for sure. They have to win more of those games as well, don't get me wrong, but I think you really have to go out and win games in the division. We talk about this all the time. It's one of your favorite points that I completely agree with. You have to win the games in division to have a good shot. And that's going to be the story of the Patriots season, because in the past couple of years in the post Tom Brady era, they've hung around and been competitive because they've been taking games off their AFC East counterparts. And that needs to be the story of this season. If I can be honest with you, I don't think it's going to be smooth sailing. I don't even think the team is going to win as many games as they did last year, and that wasn't a whole lot. But they need to go out and do that if they want to turn the tide of their season. If they get swept by Miami, they start losing to the Jets, the Bills handle business, then this Patriots team doesn't have a shot. They're not going to compete based off their out of division schedule, because once you look deeper into that, they play the Chiefs. The Saints, as you mentioned, really aren't that bad. So I don't love what I'm looking at here, but it's not impossible, I'd say. But, you don't want to overreact too early. There's a lot of season left to be played. But I think the main point that we brought up, the offensive line really needs to step up. Obviously, Strange and Onwenu have been back in the lineup, but they missed time in the preseason. They missed time week 1. And watching the Dolphins game, the broadcaster said it over and over again. The offensive line just looked out of sync. And even on that fun play where, the lateral went back to Cole Strange, he was only available for the lateral because he wasn't blocking anybody. I think that says the story of the Patriots season in one play. Yeah, it's fun for a second, but then once you actually dig down and watch the film, it was just a whole lot of bad stuff going on. So worried, I think, is the word I would use, and I would not say I'm confident.
Yeah, and looking at this team, I mean, with the Jets losing Aaron Rodgers, there's obviously a lot of questions with them, which kind of helps the Patriots. But best case scenario, if they can pull something out, I still think they're the third best team in this division. I mean, the Bills have been struggling a little bit. I think they'll be able to figure it out. The Dolphins have looked good. And like we said before, that Jets team is still constructed very well, depending on how Zach Wilson does. So it's going to be an interesting season now, too, especially for the Patriots, a team that just drafted Mac Jones just a few years ago. They are coming up to the point where I would say this is a make or break season. If you go out looking at the rest of the schedule and get 5 to 6 to 7 wins, I feel like that's pretty fair up to this point. You're in the spot for a quarterback, and especially in this loaded draft class that we've talked about every week with college football, with a bunch of great guys looking to make a spot in the NFL. Do you think it's time to go for another quarterback? I think I know your answer, but what do you, I guess I'll rephrase the question. What do you need to see from Mac Jones for him to keep his spot?
Yeah, and I want to be fair because I love to talk bad about Mac Jones, but he doesn't deserve it at this point in the year. He's had two straight good games, which is almost better than any other year. But I would say if they're hanging around a 5, 6, 7 spot, what else do you need to address in the draft? Just because it seems like every year the Patriots go out and they get an offensive lineman. They get plenty of offensive linemen every year. Some of them are good, some of them suck, whatever, and they pay attention to the defense too. They just got Gonzalez. I think he's going to be really good. He's looked the part so far. It gets to a point where what do you draft? It seems like the Patriots are going to be a team like the Packers historically were that won't take wide receivers in the first round. And that's fine. You don't have to. I would like it if they did, but it gets to a point where we haven't seen Bill Belichick ever actually draft a quarterback. Obviously, Tom Brady is the best quarterback ever, but that doesn't change the fact that he went in the 6th round. He was not a guy that Belichick had, fully scouted or was confident in. And the Mac Jones experiment, if it's a 5, 6, 7 win season, it hasn't really worked out either. So drafting quarterback makes me nervous. I think it's time. The only way Matt gets away from it is with an individual well-performing season, which he is on pace for. I don't really care if the Patriots win 11 games or 4 games. Mac Jones needs to step up and play well. We've got to the point where the Patriots have snuck into the playoffs with a good defense and with a good season from Ramondre Stevenson. It needs to be the time where Mac Jones actually plays well. It's going to shut up a lot of Patriots fans. It's going to shut me up for sure. I just need to see confidence from him. It's been tough so far with 2 games against 2 teams that blitz a lot and an offensive line that's out of sync, but he needs to put together good passing performances and just not choke the game late like we've seen so many times. I think statistically, I would, any stat you pull up, he's one of the worst clutch quarterbacks in the league. And he just needs to change that narrative of him. I would love to say go out and make the playoffs, win the division, but those are unrealistic. He needs to have a good season so, I can stop yapping and we can just, play football at that point. There's good quarterbacks in this draft, so there's going to be a lot of pressure on him, but it just needs to happen at some point.
Yeah. And speaking about drafted quarterbacks too, moving on to the Texans, who obviously a high profile quarterback coming out of Ohio State this year. They go out and they take CJ Stroud this week, having 384 yards and 2 touchdowns, the second most by a rookie that we've seen since the merger, and a absolutely fantastic game, the most passing yards that we've ever seen from an Ohio State quarterback. So maybe he could be the first one to change that narrative that Ohio State quarterbacks can be good in the NFL. We'll talk about another one later. But what do we need to see from this Texans team? Because they did lose both of these games. Obviously, Gardner Minshew went in this game and he controlled it after Anthony Richardson got hurt with a concussion. He'll be back. I don't know if he'll be back next week. It doesn't look like it. It might be a little tough, but he will come back and play at least 80% of the games this season. He has been looking good. But on the opposite end, I do want to talk about this Texans team. CJ Stroud proving through the first 2 games, 626 total yards from a rookie in 2 games is fantastic, especially when you look at this wide receiver room. Guys like John Mechie, who I like, obviously still coming off of stuff from last season. Dalton Schultz is a decent tight end. Tank Dell, we've seen kind of blow up a little bit the past few weeks. He's been good. Robert Woods and Nico Collins. I mean, at best, this is a okay wide receiver room. We don't really see a true wide receiver one in this sense. But for him to be able to go in there in his first 2 games and perform, what else do you need to see from this team for them to actually start to compete if your quarterback is already playing this well?
Yeah, and we don't need to be too professional. They have a bad receiving core, and CJ Stroud has looked really good. So, of course, I have my questions, but I don't think they're as far away from competing as maybe some other people would say. Over this preseason, this offseason, I don't know if I ever really voiced it on the podcast, but I'll admit I was nervous about Stroud in Houston because he seemed like a fit there, don't get me wrong, but he doesn't have a whole lot to work with. And early on, he's looked confident, he's looked poised, and those are the two things I was looking out for the most. Obviously, in Ohio State, he was in a great system with probably the best receiving core in the country. He didn't need to focus too much on making plays like with his legs outside of the pocket. And in Houston, he's already done some of that. He doesn't look robotic in there. He moves when he has to. He just throws the ball well. Obviously, trading up for Will Anderson this year was really risky, but I think they kind of needed to do it. Their pick next year is going to be really, really good. So that's a take that could age bad. But for Houston, I think the biggest problem is going to be their defense because Stroud has put up points. He's looked good. It seems like he'll be able to create with whatever offense they give him. But on the defensive side, they just need more playmakers. If they didn't get Will Anderson this year, they'd probably be one of those teams towards the bottom of the league that we see every year. They're just chasing edge rushers and doing everything they can to get those guys in. And now they get to step away from that for a little bit. I think they still need a lot of help in that secondary. Obviously, they took Stingley high in the draft a couple of years ago. Get him some more help, get some safeties, get a true middle linebacker so you build a solid defense. And Stroud will do it all himself on offense. I know that's very high praise for a guy I still have question marks at, but based on what I've seen so far, he's going to be a really solid quarterback. I think he's beating the Ohio State allegations. I think he has just plays a great style of football. So, I mean, that leads me into a question I want to ask you. It's super early. I'm not telling you to judge these rookie quarterbacks, but in this offseason, we saw Stroud as a guy that maybe wasn't the true number one guy in the class. Based on what we've seen early, do you think your opinion may have changed on that, or do you still have a lot of questions?
I think CJ Stroud throughout these first few games has definitely performed very well. It's been interesting too, like we've said, with that wide receiver room. I didn't expect this early to be able to come out here and see him perform this well. I think going into this draft, the question marks behind him was if he could come out and continue to be as accurate as he was before at Ohio State. He was accurate, but also he was one of those guys that we have seen, especially within the past few years, in those Ohio State and Alabama offenses. I feel like a lot of those players are playing with really good receivers, which makes the quarterbacks look good at the end of the day. And we've seen question marks with Mac Jones so far too, pointing that out. He was very good when he had the best receivers in the country with him. And now when he's on the Patriots, he hasn't really done that much with it. But now that CJ Stroud is going out there with guys who really aren't that great overall, there are some guys that I do like I said before, John Mechie, some solid guys overall. But I'm very impressed by him through the first few games. This defense does need to step it up, like you said. The one thing going into this season, too, they will have the Cleveland Browns pick. So they don't have their own pick, which is going to be tough for them. They might end up having a pick around the 15 to 25 spot, depending on how the Browns do. So if it was very different, I know that might be different from your opinion. I think the Browns will still be in that 15 to 25 spot. But either way, they're not going to be in the lottery area for a guy like Jared Verse. They're still going to be able to go out there and get a good guy. I think this defense is still weak. They have a lot of young guys like Derek Stingley, who I still think is going to be able to perform very well. We've seen cornerbacks kind of take a little while to figure it out. Obviously, other guys on this defense too that we've seen, Will Anderson will be able to figure it out too. I still think probably the best player in this draft. That defense just isn't helping CJ Stroud right now, and he's been good. And in this division, which I think is still captained by the Jaguars as of right now, just because all these teams are really young with young quarterbacks. And I think the Jaguars just have the oldest quarterback. They've been able to figure that out. But in a few years, if this team can figure it out, I think I completely agree with you. I think people aren't talking about how close this Texans team really is to competing. And I think they're going to be just like the Jaguars. They're going to have a good year this year. They're going to be able to build up those young players. And it might just take a few more players next year and the year after that. And this team can get into the playoffs within the next few years if CJ Stroud can keep playing like this. I don't think that's a bad take overall. They are going to be in a hard division, but with guys like Anthony Richardson playing very well, this is going to be a fun division in a few years, especially with this rookie quarterback class.
Yeah, I'm glad we agree. D'Amico Ryans is a great head coach too. I hope he, sticks through the long haul. But just to talk about another team that has a young quarterback and maybe more importantly a young running back, the Falcons are 2-0 in the NFC South right now. The question is if you think they're a legit threat in the NFC South, considering we both had the Saints winning this thing in the preseason.
Yeah, I think this team overall too, the Falcons, I was excited to watch them play this year. I've been excited last year too. Obviously, they have really good weapons on the offense. They just haven't been able to figure it out at quarterback. And I was fully expecting this year. I know it can still flip over. They're 2-0 right now. They still could only win 6 or 7 games. I'm hoping they go for more, but I was expecting them to kind of be in that top 15 area and maybe get a quarterback this season. But with Desmond Ritter playing all right, if you can run through Bijan Robinson and you can have Desmond Ritter, who's still young, just be that serviceable quarterback, I think you can figure it out. We've talked about the serviceable quarterback term every single week, it seems like, and that's not a bad thing. If Desmond Ritter can be a top 20 quarterback in the NFL and they can hand it off to Bijan Robinson and he can do what he needs to do, then they're going to be fine. I had Bijan Robinson as a top 3 player in this draft class just because we all knew how good he was. We just weren't sure who was going to take that risk on it. And the Falcons did, and it's already paying off. He is a fantastic back, and I think they're going to be able to have some success behind him. I do think they may still be a year away from competing. There are some holes on the defense. The offense looks very good. They're all young, great players. Bijan Robinson, Drake London, Kyle Pitts overall in this offense. But I still think they might need some pieces in the defense. And especially when you go up against tougher teams, I don't know if they can win in a shootout. That's basically what I'm saying with the defense right now. But give them another year. If they are good this year in that division that I don't think is great overall, probably the worst just because the Saints have been looking good, but I still think it's up for grabs for that title. I think they still may be 1 year away.
Yeah, and I completely understand. I think you brought up a great take, the shootout thing, because the story of the first 2 games I saw for Atlanta was the time of possession. I know that's kind of a flawed stat that old heads like to point out all the time, but I think it fits true with what Atlanta's been doing. So, I mean, they only gave up 17 first downs to the Packers the whole game. And obviously, with Bijan and this run heavy offense, they're going to cook their opponents in that time of possession field. With Desmond Ritter being one of the more accurate young quarterbacks, it also cuts down on the turnovers. So, I mean, if the Falcons have the ball in their hands for most of the game against these teams going forward, I don't expect a lot of losses coming. It might be, I would compare it a lot to like how Iowa plays college football. They just don't allow the other teams to get a bunch of shots in on offense, and it makes it really easy, especially when you're going up against these better teams. We're talking elite teams. If you have to play a team like the Eagles or the Chiefs or something like that with a high powered offense, don't let them have the ball. And that's exactly what the Falcons do to everyone. Of course, they still run the offense through Algier as well. I think him and Bijan are going to be a solid duo. They're kind of built somewhat similarly, but they do different things really well, which I think is really interesting. Bijan's a bit bigger, but he's more elusive, and Algier's a bit smaller, but runs harder. So I think that's super interesting. I think they're a team we might have slept on earlier in the year. As you mentioned, pretty bad NFC South. On paper, they're not a team that should really be competing, but if the Saints are kind of fluky like they can be sometimes, if Bryce Young has a tough first year, like a lot of first overall pick QBs do, and if the Buccaneers, cool off on this hot streak that they started with, which I think we both expect them to do a little bit, the Falcons are competing right away. For a Super Bowl, no, but to win the division, I think so.
Yeah, and specifically looking at these like last 8 weeks, they're going up against the Cardinals, the Saints, the Jets, the Bucks, the Panthers, the Colts, the Bears, and the Saints again. All of these games, if this team can look solid, those are all winnable games. You don't have to win all of those, but if you can compete and win most of those games, especially towards the end of the year, they definitely have a good shot. This team overall has a pretty easy schedule. So I think if they can figure out how to successfully run the ball, and then once the defense starts to hone in on that running game, as long as they can figure out how to throw the ball with Desmond Ritter, which they have the first 2 weeks, I think this team will be fine. And I think they definitely could see some success in the division. I wouldn't be surprised, depending on how the Saints team performs, if they go out there and it's very competitive between these two. I think both of these teams, a ceiling would probably be get into the first round and then probably lose if they're a lower seed against I mean, if they're going to be the fourth seed, they're probably going to go up against the best wild card team. But either way, I still think this team, if they make the playoffs or even if they get really close, that's definitely a successful season. And even in this draft, which I've gone on before and said, I think this will be one of the best drafts of all time. There's a lot of good players. So in that first round, if they can figure out defensive players, which I think will be very good for them, because there's going to be a lot of offensive players drafted within the first 10 or 15 picks, then this team can be good in the future and even right now.
Yeah, and recently, I think that's an incredible point. We've seen the Falcons address the offense in earlier rounds over and over again, and I think we're finally starting to see the results of that. Obviously, Bijan's a rookie, and that's a big piece of that offense, but Kyle Pitts being available and an option is huge. I know fantasy owners hate him because there's games where all he really does is block, but he's been a good player when he's on the field, no matter what he's doing. Drake London is a good receiver. I've talked bad about him in the past, but there's no denying that he's talented. And then we see guys that, they kind of came up on by accident, like Allgeier being huge. So I completely agree. Now it's time for them to go defense early. This draft class, as you mentioned, has a lot of defensive players that are worth a first round pick. They're not going to win the Super Bowl or anything. They'll have a good shot at a lot of them. This Falcons team could be good soon. It's definitely a team I slept on early. And now when I really break down their roster and see how they've been playing football, I think they could compete very, very soon. So I think that's a great point. I think the Falcons are going to be really solid sooner than I may have thought.
Yeah, and finally, we'll kick it over to a team who we both have very mixed opinions on. The Bears right now haven't been succeeding that well. And the question that's really been kicking around, which has been for the past few months, do you think the Bears are at the point struggling through these first two games where they regret getting rid of that first overall pick?
I'm going to say no. And you kind of expect me to say this because I like Justin Fields, but it's not even really even because of that. Justin Fields hasn't been good to start the season. That's not something I'm going to sit here and argue. He just isn't playing his style of football. He even said it himself. He looked really robotic, especially in that week 2 game. But realistically, if the Bears kept the first overall pick, what would they have done with it? I think we got down to the point where it either would have been Bryce Young, Jalen Carter, or Will Anderson, right? It was probably going to be one of those three guys. Will Anderson obviously would have been helpful. I'm not going to argue that. They really don't have a pass rush. But if it was Jalen Carter, I think getting value in the draft was much more useful than that. The Bears run a 4-3. Jalen Carter obviously would have got a lot of time on the field, but he would have just been one of the two defensive tackles. And for a Bears team that has a lot of missing pieces, I don't think it would have made an impact anytime soon. So I don't think you don't get much good out of that if you do it. If they take Bryce Young, then they'd have the exact same problems that they're having with Justin Fields. And even more so because they wouldn't have DJ Moore, unironically. I mean, they needed to address tackle in this draft. It was one of their biggest needs. And there wasn't the tackle they were confident with taking number one. If they took Paris Johnson, maybe, but they traded down. They get a first round pick next year. They get a second rounder the year after, and they get Darnell Wright, who's a really good tackle. I expect big things from him. I mean, yes, if you're a Bears fan, you see your team is bad and you have the number one overall pick, you go, damn, I wish we didn't trade it. But what would they have realistically taken that would have made the team better anytime soon? If Justin Fields isn't the option, luckily for them, they're going to be pretty bad this coming year. They'll have early draft picks. And as you mentioned, it's a loaded QB class. So if it's really bad, if they're the worst team in the NFL and they get Caleb Williams, I don't think they're going to be mad about not taking Bryce Young. Even if they're a little bit better than that and they get Ewers or Michael Penix is legit, Drake May is legit. Like the Bears get their QB and they got to take a good tackle, get an extra first round pick and a second next year. So if the question was, do the Bears suck? I would say yes, but do they regret trading down from number one? I hope not.
Yeah, and I agree with you in this sense. I think this year they are going to be bad. They're going to have, I would say, probably two top 10 picks, probably even higher than that with the Panthers. I don't think they're going to be that good this year. And they have the potential to get even like two top 7 picks. So you're going to be able to go out there. And if this Bears team is really bad, and I do think they are, I think they're probably a bottom 5 team right now. And I don't really see them getting that much better towards the end of the season. But you can go out there and address the quarterback position. You may not get Caleb Williams, but you're still going to have the shot to get a guy like Drake May, Michael Penix, Quinn Ewers, any of these guys who we see move up. And then with your other pick too, I mean, if you get a guy like Quinn Ewers, you can go out there in the top 10 too and get a guy who's projected like Xavier Worthy. You can get another good receiver to match with that guy. And like we've seen in the past few years, that is a good way to build. We saw the Bengals do that. Obviously, Jamar Chase and Joe Burrow, one of the best duos. And we've seen countless teams do that, the Dolphins too. So that would be a good way to rebuild. Justin Fields, like you've said, he's looked bad through the first 2 games. Just some of these stats that we've seen. 9 out of his 10 sacks this season have come after 4 seconds. This offensive line has gotten better. And this was the thing that I pointed out before this season started. He has the time to throw the ball, and he's had receivers open. We've gone through after the game, even the coaches were talking about this. Even Justin Fields was talking about this. Guys have been wide open, and he's stood in the pocket, and he just hasn't thrown the ball to them. If we talk about how far he throws the ball, I mean, we through 2 games, he has the 5th slowest time to throw the ball. On some of these plays too, he has the lowest air yards per throw. He's not throwing the ball far down the field. Only 26% of his throws have gone past the sticks. He just isn't a good quarterback in the throwing sense. He can make things happen on the ground, but if a defense comes in here and they blitz him and they figure out how to stop him running, he just doesn't know how to throw the football. So a guy like this who has enough time to throw the ball with this offensive line, who has been good and solid for them, they invested in it. I just don't think he's the answer at quarterback. I think you're going to have to figure out at the end of this season what to do with that. If you have a top 10 pick, 2 top 10 picks with that, you have to go with a quarterback in this draft just because there's so many great ones. I just don't think Justin Fields is the guy. I haven't. And as of these first 2 weeks, he just has been terrible.
Yeah, and believe me, I completely understand that. If you guys are new fans, me and Banning argue about Justin Fields all the time. The numbers are bad. I'm not going to try to twist them a different way to make them look like they're good. But what I will say is that we've seen other quarterbacks struggle with this, and they have figured it out. I know Kyler Murray is in a tough spot right now because he's hurt, but Kyler Murray was an MVP candidate just a couple of years ago for a big stretch of the season. Daniel Jones obviously is the Giants' option, and he's another guy that throws short and has a good running game. In Justin Fields' best case scenario, he doesn't have to be Mahomes. He doesn't have to be Jalen Hurts. He could just be like Daniel Jones. And I know that's a comparison you won't like because you're a Giants fan, but if we're talking about a guy that doesn't air the ball out too much and runs well, that's him. The difference is that Daniel Jones has a way better offense. I really like Dable. I know that first game was horrible. He has a way better coaching staff. And similar to Jones, and why, you're going to hate this comparison, is that they both don't have any receivers. You could say DJ Moore is the best that either of them would have. So I understand, but I don't think the Bears need. We talk about the game manager quarterback all the time, as you mentioned. Justin Fields doesn't have to go out there and be superstar. He could just be game manager. The problem is the Bears don't have a game to manage right now. They have nothing going on in that offense, and their defense isn't doing anything to keep them in the game. So obviously they chose not to take Will Anderson, and now the pass rush is a problem. So that could be another thing that ties into the original question of why fans are mad. But it's not like he's been giving much to work with. I'll keep making excuses for Justin Fields as long as I have them. And obviously, he's going to have to do something eventually. But I wouldn't write him off after, a season and 2 games, especially looking at what he's been given and looking at the type of plays that they run. At the end of the day, if he throws short and misses passes, that's his fault. But if there's so many designed short throws and screen passes to match his style of play, you can't hate on him for that. You can't expect him to throw a 40-yard bomb when they call for, a 2-yard screen. That at a point it is coaching.
Yeah, and I think the main comparison though between those 2 guys, the Daniel Jones comparison, is that we've seen Justin Fields get the time to throw the ball, and Daniel Jones has had one of the worst offensive lines in the NFL throughout his whole career up to this point. And Justin Fields, even through this game too, I mean, he had the time. If you have 4 seconds in the pocket to throw the ball and you have guys running down the field, they're wide open, and there's plenty of instances throughout this game too. I do think DJ Moore is probably the best receiver out of those 2 guys. I definitely be able to argue Darren Waller, but we haven't seen a full season yet. But this is going to be his 3rd full season almost. And Justin Fields, if he doesn't get it this season, I think he's still in that spot with a guy like Mac Jones. These 2019 quarterbacks who we both were very happy with. We had some high expectations for these guys. We haven't seen that much coming out of it. If we throw in a guy like Trey Lance too, obviously he hasn't had the same experience just because an injury when he was supposed to be the guy to step up. Now he's in Dallas, the backup to Dak Prescott. I guess the third string quarterback. He's the emergency quarterback at this point. But this draft class overall, which we expected a lot of good quarterbacks, there's been a lot of questionable guys. I mean, I'm going to need to see a very big turnaround if you want to keep Justin Fields on the Bears after this season. I think he might be a guy that would benefit from going to a different spot, which we've seen in his career. He was at Georgia and then he didn't succeed. He went over to Ohio State and that offense figured it out with him. So I don't think if you're the Bears at this point, you can still invest in a quarterback next season in the draft. If Justin Fields goes somewhere else, he might figure it out. He might just need a new offense, and that's fine. I think if you're the Bears, you can't go out there and get a new offensive philosophy to fill him, especially if you're going to get a quarterback in this next draft. But I just don't think the combination of Justin Fields and the Bears is a good one as of right now. And I think with a guy like DJ Moore and these young receivers, I think you go out next year, unless something completely flips towards the end of the season, which I don't see happening. I think the Bears are in the market for a quarterback, and you're going to have 2 top 10 picks. You might as well go out there and pair him with another good receiver. If not, I mean, if you have 2 top 5 picks, if the Panthers are really that bad, go out there and get a guy like Jared Verse to go strengthen up your edge on defense. And this Bears team could be solid in a few years if they figure it out.
Yeah, what I will say is I did just say nice things about Justin Fields, but I completely agree with what you just said. If the Bears are really, really bad, you're not only are you in the market for a quarterback, you should take one. And I know this guy is controversial, but probably the best Bears QB almost in their history would be Jay Cutler. And Jay Cutler's whole philosophy of football was a lot different than Justin Fields. Justin Fields, as you mentioned, all the stats prove it. He waits too long, and then sometimes he clocks out and just runs for no reason, right? That is the opposite of Jay Cutler. Jay Cutler would make decisions fast, and some of them will be horrible, but some of them will be really, really good. And he had a rocket on him, and that's just how the Bears need their quarterback to play. And so, if that can be Caleb Williams, and Caleb Williams, better prospect than Jay Cutler, don't get me wrong, but he has the arm for it and he has the decision making for it. It would be a good fit. Even Drake May, I think, describes what I just said really well. Michael Penix, too. So, I mean, those are 3 of the top QBs in the draft. If they can get one, I think they should. It fits what they want to do more. But I don't think that this is necessarily all the fault of Justin Fields. And I think that's what a lot of people are coming back to. I think the Bears and the Texans rosters are a lot closer than people want to admit. But because people play fantasy football and like Justin Fields, they projected the Bears to get 10 wins and the Texans to get 3. And I think that's just the way sports media works sometimes. So if the Bears move on from Justin Fields, completely understand. Maybe the Patriots can go out and get him. That's what I wanted on draft night. But I don't want this all to fall on Justin Fields, at least when I get to talk about it.
Yeah. And with that being said, obviously a lot going on in the NFL with some injuries and some trades. And if you guys haven't been keeping up, there's a lot that goes on in the NFL and the NBA worlds, the MLB overall throughout the week. And we come on here and talk about sports every week. But if you guys want to see a little more, maybe more things in real life time, if you haven't checked out our TikTok yet, we go out there and we talk about things as they happen to. It's just a quick way to be able to talk about stuff like that. The Cam Akers trade going on. Hopefully we'll see him go somewhere else. Still a good young player. Shohei Ohtani, the injury to him. We've seen a lot of topics come up recently. So if you haven't checked that out, make sure to go check that out. With that being said, we'll see you guys next week with hopefully some more NFL news, and maybe some of these teams will start to turn it around.
Yeah, before I say bye to you guys too, if you have anything you want us to talk about in an episode, comment it on YouTube, DM us on Instagram. You know our socials, so just let us know. We make the videos for you guys, so we appreciate the support as always, and we'll see you guys later. Appreciate it.